Welcome, everyone, to the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast on YouTube. I'm your co host, Jim Hessler. As regular followers of the podcast know, in addition to being a Gettysburg historian, I am a lifelong enthusiast of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Custer's Last Stand, the life and times of George Armstrong Custer, really whatever it is, the American West has just always fascinated me in general. So occasionally here on the YouTube channel, I'll veer off course a little bit and sometimes bring on other authors, historians, friends to talk about topics of interest that might not be directly correlated to the Battle of Gettysburg. We're recording today on December 5th, which coincidentally happens to be the birthday of George Armstrong Custer. So I thought, what better way for historians to celebrate than to have a conversation with Michael Donahue? Now, many of you in the Little Bighorn field will know Mike, maybe not as familiar to those of you in the Civil War field, but Michael Donahue has been a ranger at the Little Bighorn National Monument for about 34 years. He's actually been studying the Battle of Little Bighorn for about 43 years, and I clearly think he is the premier, or certainly one of the premier living historians today in the Little Bighorn field. Now, before I forget, because I know I'm going to forget, he's also an accomplished artist. And he is currently the chair of the Temple College Art Department and is a nationally recognized artist included in over 50 exhibitions. But on the Little Bighorn side, in addition to having written a number of articles in our scholarly journals for the Little Bighorn Associates or the CBHMA, Mike has also authored two full-length books that are essential additions to any library on the Little Bighorn topic. And again, some of you are going to be familiar with these already. His first one, Drawing Battle Lines, the map testimony of Custer's last fight, as the name implies, is the most comprehensive collection of maps assembled for the Little Bighorn that you're ever going to see in one volume. And this book has been recently reissued with some new material as well. So Mike will probably talk about that. His next book, Where the Rivers Ran Red, The Indian Fights of George Armstrong Custer, took a look at Custer's really entire post-Civil War career and then tried to use those experiences to somewhat draw some conclusions about what Custer's strategy at Little Bighorn might have been. Now, you can guess anytime somebody puts an opinion out in this field, not everybody's going to agree with it, but I can't think of anybody who is in a better position to talk and defend this topic.
Well, thank you, Jim. I tell you what, it's just a real honor and a privilege to be talking to your group tonight and to see you again after last summer when we got to co-tour a little bit together. And really, we got to spend a little bit of time together for the first time. And I do appreciate the invitation to talk tonight.
Yeah, you know, the honor really was all mine on that. I basically was just your wingman on the Yellowstone tour for the LBHA. And then I was lucky enough to sit at the same table with you during our sort of panel discussion on stage. So no, the honor is all mine. And I know how busy you are. And I really, I appreciate you've taken the time to do this. This could open up a whole new Civil War audience for you, Mike. I'm
fantastic.
Yeah, thinking we might do that. So I already did an intro where I gushed about your qualifications, both in the art field and in the history field, but some of my audience is going to be Civil War enthusiasts and might not be as familiar with you and your work as obviously Little Bighorn people are. Do you kind of just want to start and tell us, how you became a ranger at Little Bighorn and really how you got into this topic in general?
Right. Well, when I was 18 and in high school, one of my teachers in history, for whatever reason, in Texas history, we talked about Battle of Little Bighorn, which didn't take place in Texas, but he loved to talk about that story. And then I started reading about it in high school and had never ever thought about working at Little Bighorn until about the mid-1980s. National Geographic came out with a wonderful article about the new archaeological digs that took place after 1983 when there was a major fire there. And the archaeologists got out there with volunteers and metal detectors, and they found thousands of artifacts in 1984 and 1985. And all that information was published in the National Geographic, which I took at the time. I opened that up one day and was just, it boggled my mind how that the artifacts had changed the story of Little Bighorn that I had grown up with and known about from movies and reading books and so forth. Yeah. It was like a new place all of a sudden. And so I immediately, in about 1987, made a phone call one day to the battlefield to see if they had any summer jobs, because I was off in the summer from teaching. Mm-hmm. And got a hold of a guy named Neil Mangum, who answered the phone. A lot of people know him from Civil War history things. And I asked Neil, I said, "You got any jobs in the summer? I saw we are doing metal detecting, and I'd love to be a part of that." He said, "Well, we've done with the metal detecting for a while. However, the only jobs we have are volunteer jobs, and it pays a whopping $7 a day, but we'll give you a free place to stay." And so I thought about it, and I decided to go for it. I'd never been to Montana, never been to the battlefield. I had done some reading, and when I got there, I got a volunteer suit to put on, brown and so forth, and I was expecting just to do whatever they needed me to do.
Right.
And the first week of in-service there, Neil had the interpretive staff there doing 12 different interpretive talks. I mean, he was definitely a guy who wanted excellence there. And believe it or not, back then, most of the interpretation wasn't done by the National Park Service. They had only a few rangers. It was done by the Custer Battlefield Historical Museum Association.
Ah, okay. Interesting.
They took care of the bookstore. Mm-hmm. They did tours, and they did a lot of the talks on the patio at the battlefield. And so I was just kind of watching these two groups, Park Service Rangers and Custer Battlefield Historical Museum Association people doing all the talks. And there was a woman who had thought she wanted to be an interpreter there. And all of a sudden, after a week of all this pressure and having to learn all these talks, she threw in the towel. And so Neil came up to me and said, "Donahue, how would you like to make $7 an hour rather than $7 a day?" And I said, "That's a no-brainer." And so they hired me on as an interpreter for the association. And that lasted until the mid-1990s, in which one of my good friends who was a park ranger was actually murdered. His name was Cliff Nelson.
Yeah.
A lot of people know who Cliff Nelson was. And so they had a spot on the Park Service Ranger crew there, and I was able to fill that position. And I've been there for 35 summers. I mean, I'm passionate for the place. I love the story. I've been reading about it for almost 50 years now. Mm-hmm. And it's a real advantage to be able to live on the battlefield and to get into the archives, to walk the battlefield whenever you want to. And probably there's been no other author or even park ranger who's had that luxury and a privilege to be able to get into the archives so much and to become so intimately knowledgeable about the landscape and the surrounding landscape of the battle, because that's so important to understanding the Battle of Little Bighorn.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's funny you mentioned National Geographic, because I remember that distinctly. My grandfather had a copy of that, and that was one of the things that also piqued my interest too. And at some point I said, "Hey, Grandpa, can I borrow this?" And I still have that copy. So I know exactly where you're coming from on that.
And the Titanic was in that article too.
Yes, it was. That's right. It was a
like
double
header.
Double,
like a double whammy.
Bighorn and Titanic. This was amazing. So dealing with the public, and obviously something I can relate to as a guide at Gettysburg, you're giving these interpretive talks. As you deal with the public over all of these years, what are some of your favorite myths and misconceptions that, A, maybe you think the general public has, and B, maybe even some of the more seasoned students are still holding on to?
Yeah. One of the things, there are just so many myths. And 90% of the people that come to the battlefield have never been there before. Okay. And that's a statistic that we ask almost every talk out there. And it's amazing. And then everyone there has heard of George Armstrong, Custer, and Sitting Bull, but most of them don't have a lot of knowledge base, except for the fact that they died with their boots on, or they've seen Little Big Man.
Right.
And or they may have read one or two books or a couple of articles, but they come in with tremendous misconceptions about the battle. And that's one of my joyful duties, is to be a myth buster.
Mm-hmm.
And I love doing that because not that I love telling people that their information is incorrect, but let's face it, I'm an educator in art most of the year, and then I get to be an educator for 3 months about history, which are both things I got degrees in history and in college. And so I really like the fact that people walk away from a talk and they said, "Man, I never even knew about that. I never learned about that." And I appreciate the new information you gave us. It helps us to understand what really happened at Little Bighorn. And that's the best pat on the back you can get, as you know, from a person who walks into a battlefield, whether it's Gettysburg or Little Bighorn. And but there's so many myths. There's the myth that Comanche is the only surviving horse or the only survivor of the battlefield, which is really detrimental to the fact that there were over 2,000 warriors who survived the battle. And we used to have a display in there, and it said that Comanche is the only survivor of the Battle of Bighorn. And I always thought, how does that make Native Americans feel?
Yeah, right.
Walk in and you see that. And, the myths about the weaponry there too, that the Indians had all these wonderful weapons. And that was the major change that whipped Custer there, was all the weaponry. And when we really talk about that quite a bit, we know that's not necessarily the case.
Okay.
There's just so many different kind of myths. Custer was chased to the top of the hill. That's a myth that was there for over 100 years. There's this huge numbers of warriors chasing to a hilltop, and he was wiped out on top of a hill. Well, today we know that's not the truth.
Mm-hmm.
We know from archaeology and Indian accounts that Custer went beyond that hill and came back to it. So those are kind of things that most people don't know about. And so those are wonderful things to talk about.
I assume you find most people come in with a negative perception of not only Custer, but probably the entire mission of the Frontier Army in general. I mean, would that be a relatively safe assessment to make?
I think it's true. And it depends on the time period too. Things have changed a lot. There was a lot of animosity and angst about the Custer persona and the role of the military there. When I first got there in the 1980s, I arrived in 1987, was my first summer there. And one of the things that was fascinating was Neil Mangum, as the chief of interp there and historian, said, we all have to get out there and tell a fair and unbiased story. That would be like at Gettysburg, talking about nothing but the Northern troops.
That's
forgetting
exactly right.
Was there.
That's right.
And that's kind of what was happening at Little Bighorn. We were out there explaining the Cheyenne story, the Lakota story, the Crow story, the Arapahoes, the Arikaras. We were explaining all those things on the patio every day. And we were also talking about the military. However, no matter what we said on the patio, the battlefield physically was speaking something else. And what I mean by that, number one, when you walked into the front gate, it said Custer Battlefield, which offended a lot of the tribes, number one, because it was named after someone who lost the battle. But number two is the battlefield itself was speaking only about the soldiers. There's soldier markers everywhere, the white marble markers, over 200 of those spread around on the Custer end of the fight. There was the monument to the soldiers, the mass grave. But there was only one small wooden marker to an Indian warrior by the name of Lame White Man, halfway down the road. And there was nothing else to really physically talk about the warriors and what they did there. And no matter what you said on the patio, people looked at this as, man, the Park Service is biased. They're not being fair in their interpretation. Mm-hmm. And what I noticed is when the actual Indian memorial was actually finished in the early 2000s, that a lot of that anger and angst totally disappeared, because all of a sudden the battlefield was physically becoming balanced as far as what the public thought was the interpretive story. We also put the red marble markers up for the warriors, and that made a huge difference. It was no longer just white markers where soldiers fell. There were red markers where warriors fell.
Okay.
And so people could visualize and picture what happened on the battlefield. And so those are some things that I've seen change. I'm actually, believe it or not, working on a book right now. Hope it'll be out in the next year or so about my 35 years of what I've witnessed as far as changes there.
Oh, no
what
kidding.
it's like to be a park ranger there, everything from the Indian Memorial to the Russell Means protest there on the battlefield, to the way things have changed in interpretation there, and the way things are going, which may not be in a very positive way.
Right.
And so those are all things that I'm working on, and hopefully been working on it for a couple of years now.
Okay.
I'm hoping it'll be interesting to people.
Yeah,
Not,
I had no
it's
idea.
kind of, it's kind of a biography of me, but it's also really a biography of the battlefield and the things that I've seen that have happened there. Some of them are crazy humorous. I mean, there's some crazy funny stories of things that happened there, but there's also some real poignant, sad, tragic things that people come there and display and talk about. And so it's that yin and yang that we get to play around with. And I'm sure that happens at Gettysburg as well.
So then at what point, you've got all these crazy experiences, and you've kind of segged into my next question. And as far as writing goes, there's a lot of seasonal interpreters within the National Park Service. At what point did you kind of say to yourself, I've got more to say here, I want to start writing, whether it be the articles or the books? At what point did you kind of make that turn?
I'm an artist first. I was educated as an artist. And so I was taught for years and years to be able to speak nonverbally in artistic terms, in pictures and so forth. And I've always loved art and drawings and so forth. And I'm really drawn to a lot of the art of Little Bighorn. And I talk about that quite a bit. But one of the things, as as a historian at any battlefield, is you have to read everything there is that comes out. It's an expensive hobby. I never realized I would spend so much of my paychecks on books.
Yeah.
And as there's a tremendous number of books on Little Bighorn and the personalities involved, over 3,000 at this point. And, it always seemed like there was like this weird competition of how many books are coming out on Gettysburg and how many are coming out at Little Bighorn. We used to actually do a tally of that. I don't know why, but we used to do that to see, well, wow. It was almost like a game of one-upsmanship with Gettysburg. But the fact of the matter is, there's some really bad books out there.
Yeah.
And as I began to read more and more and become more of a critical thinker about a lot of these books, and realizing a lot of these people writing books had only been out there for a few days. They didn't know the battlefield. They didn't get in the archives for very long. And yet most of them were writing from other books that were in their library. And so it was a lot of regurgitation of a lot of the same information. And a lot of it was misleading. Some of it was just pure misinformation. And so that was something that began to bother me a little bit. And it took years and years for me to have the intestinal fortitude to decide, because I'm not a writer, but I'm a storyteller. I know how to tell a good story.
Yeah.
And so when I decided to write a book, I decided to do it as if I was telling a story.
Okay.
And so the second book that I wrote is definitely a storytelling book. The first book that I wrote was called Drawing Battle Lines, and that kind of happened by pure chance. I was at the battlefield in the archives all the time, and I began to notice there's a lot of maps by Walter Camp and other people that were in the archives that no one had ever seen and never been published. And I kept finding more and more and more. And then I began to find more maps in other collections around the country. And Thomas Beaker, and I know a lot of people know Thomas Beaker. He's gone now. Unfortunately, he was a historian over at Fort Robinson. And I talked to him one day, and he said, "You know what? I've always thought about doing a book on Little Bighorn and all the maps, but I'm never going to do it. I just don't have the time. But here I've got a bunch of maps that I've collected over the years. Why don't you take mine and work on a book?" And so with his encouragement and his thoughtfulness of sharing some of those maps, I was able to start just putting them together. And first there was 20, then there was 30, then there was 50, then there was 60, then there was 70, then there was 80 maps. And I chose to really focus on maps that were only made by people who were either at the battle, who were eyewitnesses, or people who interviewed eyewitnesses. Because if you go beyond that, there's literally hundreds and hundreds of maps made by later day researchers and so forth. But I wasn't going to go there.
Right.
And so I tried to find out something as I could about the biographers who made the maps, their stories about the maps, and then the maps themselves. One of the things that I noticed in a lot of publications and books was that quite often, to save money, the authors would redraw the maps where they wouldn't have to pay usage fees. And what I began to notice is a lot of the maps were incorrect. They left out important lines.
Mm-hmm.
And me living on the battlefield for over almost 2-3 decades now, I knew what every line meant. I knew the story intimately. And so I just seemed to be the right guy at the right time and allowed us just pure chance. But I began to collect these maps, and I'm still getting maps. People say, hey, you're the map guy. How about putting this in your new edition of your new book or whatever? Tell me about this map. And so they send me stuff and I research it. And my newest recent revision of drawing battle lines includes, I think, 10 or 12 new maps that people send to me that I didn't even discover. They send. So it's kind of one of those ongoing things. Richard Upton, who did the first publication of that book, he printed 3 editions of it, but he never would revise it. He refused to revise it because it was going to cost more money.
Right.
Something I learned the hard way from publications and trying to publish a book was he was supposed to pick up all those usage fees, but he didn't.
Ouch.
And me being an idiot, I paid for all those, which totaled almost $2,500 for just the usage fees for the map.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at you look at that book, which is a very valuable book, by the way.
Oh, it's an essential book.
Well, it's essential if you're studying the battle.
Yeah.
It's got the original maps. They're not copies. They're not some rendition by an artist. Those are the maps that the people that were there made, or the people who talked to the people made, like Walter Camp and Kuhlman and some of those other folks.
Is there one or maybe a series of maps that yielded the biggest aha moment for you, that when you saw, you were like, wow, this might actually change my interpretation of, what I think happened?
Absolutely. And it's changed the interpretation of the battle. I never thought that I'd have a hand in changing the interpretation of a story that's over 100 years old. But one of the things that I found right off the bat was I found a map called 100 map 8 map that was in the National Archives. And when I started looking at it, it was made by an Indian that was there at the battle, and it was in the National Archives. It had never been published before. And I shared it with Richard Fox, and Richard Fox, when he was working on his book, said, but this is an important map. This shows some stuff that nobody seems to talk about. And this is this idea of Custer going beyond the last stand hill, and down towards the river that was shocking to a lot of folks. And then I began to find more maps that said the same thing. And then John Stanzentimber's maps came into play. And he went down there with his step-grandfather, who was there at the battle, and they talked about these movements towards it. There just seemed to be more and more and more of these warrior maps that talked about this extension beyond Custer Hill. And it was just something that couldn't be denied after a while. I even heard a very well-known historian who's a professor stand on top of Last Stand Hill one time and said, all this baloney about Custer going to the hill is purely baloney. The idea of trying to capture non-combatants and all that's just not the case. And I heard him say that. And then a few years later, he got a copy of my book. And he had to do an actual thesis on all the maps made on the battle. And he borrowed on my book heavily. And he made a complete about face. And it was so refreshing to hear someone who really carefully looked at the maps realize, hey, there is something here. These maps are artifacts. They're just as important as any casing, any bullet, any bone found on the battlefield.
Yeah.
They are artifacts. People don't look at them that way, but they really are.
How is the archaeology on that part of the field supported John Stanzentimber and some of the other maps that talk about that movement?
Right. For years and years, there was nothing done down there. There was just, again, we had this idea that Custer stopped it. Why go beyond that area?
Right.
To look for anything, because it just didn't happen. Well, in the 1984, 85 digs, they actually went down into this area below the housing area, which is down below the river. And they began to find just a few small artifacts down there. And it was puzzling that we didn't find more until I began to do some research and find out that the entire area, acres and acres down there, had become a gravel pit in the 1950s.
Okay.
And if there was anything down there, it was destroyed because they took all those tons of gravel from that area and they put the new road in the 1950s, late 1950s. And so anything that was down there has been disturbed and reburied under the tons of dirt that are under the contemporary road, which exists today.
Mm-hmm.
There were other people who found things over the years down in that area, but things didn't really happen until recently. Down below where John Stanton Timber said some things took place, heavily vegetated. Unless you're there at a certain time of year and you have a lot of patience and a lot of time. Even I and John Dorner, historian, went down there one day with metal detectors, and it was just an impossible task to metal detect. We were there in the summertime and things were up to our knees, and you just can't metal detect. Well, Jason Pitch, who's our local rancher, he read my book about the John Stanton Timber information, and he had permission from the landowner to go down and metal detect and begin to find all kinds of things. He was able to go in the off season when the grass was down, and all that information was sent to Doug Scott, who most people know as being one of the major archaeologists on the digs in the 84 and 85 digs,
Right.
as well as the others. And he, out of his personal time at no pay, he went in there and did cartridge casing matchings, fingerprint impression suppression matches, found out how many weapons were down there, both Indian and soldier. And it began to match exactly what John Stanton Timber said happened down there.
Mm-hmm.
So this is all new information. It was published in last summer's Greasy Grass for the first time, which was published by the Custer Battlefield Historical Museum
Right.
Association. So it's great information. And again, it helps to change the story because no longer is it just a story. Now we have artifactual concrete evidence that something did take place down there between the warriors and the soldiers because of their weaponry and bullets and their casings down there.
Look, let's issue the disclaimer now so that
Yeah.
we don't have to caveat every question and answer.
Okay.
Of course, nobody knows exactly what happened, but I can't think of anybody who is better positioned to theorize on it than you are. So we'll kind of get that legal disclaimer out of the way right away. But for the Stanton Timber, the 4D sort of episode, what would you say to the critic who might say, well, how come we don't have more warrior accounts of action taking place down there? What would you say to that critic?
Well, the critic who says that, by the way, obviously didn't talk to Hanging Wolf and some of the non-combatants that were down there. And I think one of the things that people have to realize is that a lot of the warriors, the so-called important warriors like Rain in the Face and Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and many others, did not see the action down there. Matter of fact, if you've been on the terrain, you know that it's impossible to see down in that area. As a matter of fact, Wolftooth and Bigfoot, who talk about the troops going down there, said they went out of sight and we didn't see them. They didn't chase them down there.
Mm-hmm.
So even they didn't see what the soldiers were doing down there. It's Stanton Timbers being able to piecemeal the story together from different participants. But the fact of the matter is, there were probably 3,000 women and children right down in that area, right across from that crossing, which, by the way, it's not 4D, believe it or not.
Okay.
And I just wrote an article that'll be in Greasy Grass next summer about all the different fords and how they've been mislabeled by folks. And not that you're one of those mislabelers, but the fact of the matter is Gibbon talks about 2 fords in the valley right down there where Hanging Wolf was. And they're mapped by the military. And they're also forged to this day, by the way.
Okay.
They haven't changed a lot over the years. And so in this article that's coming out, I've tried to clarify the numbers and the names of some of the fords. And there are many fords, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
There was more than just Ford A and B and D. And I'm going to talk about that in great detail because I'm, again, familiar with the river, how it's changed.
Right.
And, of course, the story. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of these researchers, early researchers, did not talk to the non-combatants.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't talk to the women who were down there.
Right.
Now, some of the oral testimonies and oral histories about some of the modern day Lakota will talk about some of these things. They know about it, but a lot of that's never been published. None of it's been written down. So that answers some of I hope that answers some of the critics. Part of it is not being at the right place at the right time to see things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fair.
And Custer probably was oblivious to what was happening on the Battle Ridge as well, because he was out of sight.
And I want to come back to that. So why don't, before we continue down the path of fake 4D, we'll call it, why don't we rewind first and let's talk about the next book, Where the
Yeah.
Rivers Ran Red, which
Okay.
you talked about that a little bit earlier. It's more of a story than the map book. I think one of the things that's innovative about that book, Where the Rivers Ran Red, is how I think for the first time somebody really tried to put together Custer's post Civil War experience and then sort of come up with a rational battlefield personality and then ultimately a strategy that you think he might have been pursuing at Little Bighorn. You know, too often we sort of go from the boy general of the Civil War to the Washita to the Little Bighorn and kind of
Yeah.
leave a lot of gaps in between, right? So let me start by just why did you decide to take that approach? I mean, it seems like a very common sense approach, but really a lot of people had not done it before. So my first question is, why did you decide to take that approach? And then the second part of that would be, overall, how would you rate the George Armstrong Custer of the Plains in terms of, you know, as a military tactician or strategist?
Right. Those are great questions. Let me answer the first one a little bit, and I'll try to remember the second one here in a second. One of the things that I found interesting about, if I was going to do something here, I'm an artist, I'm a painter, and I don't want to paint something someone else has already painted.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of took that approach with history. I don't want to write a book that someone else has already written, you know, and just rehash something or make a twist on it. That's why I made the map book. There was not another map book out there. It was the first real conclusive, comprehensive map book to exist. And that's why I wanted to do that, because number one, it was kind of original, it was different. Then I began to start looking around. Well, what else is different? What else has not really been covered by authors? And you know, Jerry Green and Hardoff did wonderful books on the Washita. I mean, unbelievable books. Lubetkin's done some really good books about the 73 Yellowstone fights. There's been hundreds of books written about Little Bighorn. But what I was surprised at is that no one had taken those 4 battles and just put them all together in one book.
Right.
And it's not a book about, it's not a biography of Custer.
Right.
It's not a Civil War biography of Custer. It's about his Indian fighting career. And he only fought Indians 4 times. So I didn't have to do like Irwin did and do Custer Victorious, which has got all those Civil War battles and beautifully written and described what he did. And the books on Gettysburg and Custer. Because what I discovered is I began to read and I began to really critically look at Custer and his personality and his tactics. And by the way, Where the Rivers Ran Red is more than just a tactical book. But I never thought you could understand Little Bighorn unless you looked at the Washita carefully. Engagements with the warriors. And no one had ever done that before. So again, to me, it was an original concept. It's something that was not just another rehash of another rehash of another rehash. And so I started with the Washita and began to do some heavy-duty research there, not only writing and reading, but also field research, going down to Washington, Oklahoma. And then I began to do the same thing on the 2 fights along the Yellowstone when he's acting as escort for the surveyors. And then, of course, I know quite a bit about the Little Bighorn. So I was trying to mesh those things together. And one of the things that I know, and anybody who's read Robert Utley's book, Custer, Cavalier and Buckskins, hit it on the head. The Civil War Custer was different than the Indian Wars Custer. Morale of the men, but in the fighting force he was fighting with. But he went through kind of what I would call a meltdown after the Civil War. You know, he gets in trouble with the Hancock expedition. He gets in trouble and gets court-martialed for leading his troops. A lot of negative things are starting to happen to Custer that he didn't have to deal with in the Civil War. And how he adapted to that. Utley does a great job of describing the difficulty that he had, almost like a midlife crisis.
Yeah, yeah.
And it would be the Washita that would, of course, pole vault him back into the national limelight, if you want to call it that. But with the Washita also came controversy. Easterners back thinking about, well, this was a massacre of peaceful Indians. People out west were saying, boy, they got what they deserved. They've been raiding around the neighborhood in Kansas and so forth. But Custer, I think by mistake, stumbles upon something that he didn't use in the Civil War. And that was the fact that he becomes overwhelmed by 2,000 warriors at the Washita. And it could have very easily been his last stand right there at the Washita. He attacks this small satellite village under Black Kettle. He's surrounded by about 1,500 to 2,000 warriors, just like at Little Bighorn. Mm-hmm. And they're sniping at him and they're surrounding him. Thank God he gets his reinforcements and ammunition at just the perfect time, because he was running out of ammo down there and he was surrounded. He does these little probes out there. But the one thing that began, and I don't think he planned it, but he put all the captured women and children, the 53 captured women and children, in the middle of the troops that were firing at all these distant snipers. And when the snipers began to shoot into those women and children and troops, the women began to scream and holler, and they stopped shooting down there. And Custer must have realized what was happening. Not that he intended it. We can get into some really interesting stuff about hostage taking right now with the world news.
Yeah.
He takes these hostages, and then he actually puts them in the middle of his troops when he bluffs, and it's like he's going to go downstream and attack the village. And the villagers that are sniping are going to shoot at him said, we didn't shoot at him because we were afraid we'd hit our friends, those Cheyenne women and children. So Custer uses a body shield 2 times at the Washita. And I know military guys that go bananas when you talk about that.
Well, you just predicted my next comment. Yeah.
They go bananas.
Why is that?
Do that. We would never do that. He did it.
Yeah.
John Ryan talks about that he did it. There's no, you can't make this stuff up. It's soldiers were there and they talk about it. And the Indians talk about it as well when you look at both sides of the thing. Interesting enough, I think Custer, when he comes back 2 weeks later, he finds Clara Blinn and her little son mutilated and killed. And I think Custer, being the romantic guy he was, and what I mean by romantic, a romantic of that period, the Victorian period, who really loved the female gender, by the way. I think that he really took it hard when he saw those bodies scalped and mutilated, laying in the snow, frozen there. A young kid picked up by his feet and his head's bashed against a tree there. By who, we don't know exactly which tribe did it, but they were some of the downstream tribes there. And I think it affected him because he talks about it later on in his book, My Life on the Plains. He talks about it.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
And so I think if you want to understand Custer during this period, you have to read his thoughts. Where can you read his thoughts? In his book.
Yeah.
How can you judge Custer? By his actions. And his actions and his thoughts match. You don't have to make it up. You don't have to say, well, Custer would have done this. Custer would have done this. You don't have to play those modern military games at all. All you've got to do is go back and read his own thoughts and his own words. Mm-hmm. And so right after the Washita, he stumbles upon the Arapaho village. He doesn't attack it, but he says, I decided to place my troops among the women and children because I was thinking that they basically would be a body shield. There wouldn't be any outbreak of violence because I was right in the middle of them. Now, scholars and historians have just kind of blown that off. They have just ignored it because it's not the Custer of the Civil War at Gettysburg.
Right.
It's a totally different Custer. And he said to himself, and he wrote about it, he had to use different rules of conduct. Mm-hmm. He's not flanking. He's not cutting off supply lines. He's not doing any of that stuff anymore. And by the way, he doesn't know how many women and children are in some of these villages that he's approaching, by the way, hostages. So again, I think the Clara Blinn thing has a major influence on him because he does talk about it. We know that he takes the Kiowa chiefs hostage, threatens to hang them, uses them as a way to get the chiefs and their villages back to the reservation. He does the same thing with the Cheyennes in not only getting among the women and children in the Cheyenne village, but also taking hostages there as well and threatening them to hang them if they didn't give back 2 white women that the village had in the Sweetwater area of Texas in the Panhandle. And he was successful each time. And then he goes into the Black Hills, and what does he do? Takes a hostage, a guy named Stab, keeps him through the whole thing, They go out of the Black Hills. He uses as a guide, probably as a translator as well, trying to figure out what the Lakota are doing in the Black Hills during that time. And then he gives him food and lets him go. So you have time after time after time, 7 times he does that. And I've never seen another account in any book written of the hundreds of books in Little Bighorn that deal with that thought process. And it's all out of Custer's head and all out of his mouth.
Yeah. And I think that's the defining signature of your book, really, is how you put all of that together and carry it through. And, you're right. A lot of us like the theory, makes sense, but there have been critics of it, as you said, people who, get upset at the idea of him doing this. Do you think, I think it speaks well of Custer as a strategist and a tactician, and that he is adapting to the environment he's in.
Exactly, Jim.
And I don't understand why people get upset over it.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't fit their iconic view of Custer. It just doesn't.
Yeah.
Because, they want to see Custer with his saber on the back of the horse charging through Jeb Stuart. And that's the image they want to talk about doing that with the Indians as well. The real clincher to me, and again, if you start reading books on Little Bighorn, it gets totally eliminated. And I don't know why exactly, except for maybe what we're talking about, is when Custer first sees the village, he looks down with his Indian scouts and he sees right below the bluffs there, he sees a satellite village, by the way, of women and children and dogs and ponies milling around, and he sees no warriors in the camp down below him. And he and his scouts believe that the warriors are away from the camp.
Mm-hmm.
And this is talked about by Giovanni Martini, or John Martin, who, by the way, is the only ear witness to hear what Custer said. He's the only man who hears what Custer plans on doing. And guess what people have done for 140 something years? They'd ignored John Martin's account because it doesn't mesh with what we want to believe about George Custer.
Yeah.
So what does he say? We will cross the village and capture the women and children. When the warriors return, they'll have to give up. God, isn't that amazing? A neon light goes off.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking about doing the same thing he's done 7 other times.
Okay.
But you got to connect the dots, and people are not. You've got to know the story. You've got to do some deep research, and you've got to be able to put all this together. And is that exactly what happened? We'll never know. Was that what Custer intended when he went down to the valley? We'll never know. And that's what makes it so much fun to talk about. That's why we're here tonight.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's
one of those things of what if, and I'm not I will testify. I don't know exactly what was in his mind, but I only know what he said he was going to do.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's all we can rely on. It's all we can rely on. It's his own words, his own actions. And by the way, the move to the north, right down where the women and children are.
Well, so you kind of, now that we're back to Little Bighorn, you kind of started to address my next question, but we'll kind of just take it sequentially here a little bit. Okay. Social media on a daily basis kind of argues the whole Reno Benteen question. In the interest of time, I don't really want to do that with you tonight. Sure. I certainly think there's been more compelling aspects of your work than that, but I will ask, when Reno goes into action, and again, you kind of already touched on this, but when Reno goes into action, and instead of supporting behind Reno, Custer takes a different route onto the other side of the river, and of course starts to move up north. Just based on your experience, what do you think at that time Custer was moving north intending to do?
That's a great question, and it's a question that's overlooked by a lot of people who, again, don't know the small details of what happened. I truly believe that Custer might have intended to follow Reno into the valley.
Okay.
I really do. There's no clue that he wasn't planning on doing that. And, he gave Reno that ability to attack basically because of his rank. Custer was trying to be fair with the different officers, and Major Reno had the rank over everybody else, except for himself, of course. I think one of the things that people forget about at the Ouachita, Custer almost gets in trouble because he's afraid that the Indian village is going to cut off his supply train and his ammunition.
Right.
That was his greatest fear at the Ouachita. And that's why in the middle of the night, he marched all night long. Even though his guys were exhausted, he had to make sure his pack trains with all the ammunition, and the wagons were safe. He had to be concerned about that. I think he's concerned about that at Little Bighorn. He's had a fiasco for 2 days trying to get his pack mules packed and then to the battlefield area.
Right.
It's been a constant pain. He's penalizing officers who don't pack their mules correctly. It's become a thorn in his booty. And so Custer is concerned about that pack train, where it is, how it's being, he assigned extra men to watch it to be sure it was safe. However, as he's sitting there watering his horses on the North Fork of Reno Creek, after Reno's already departed, he's sitting there, and Daniel Knipe talks about it. Daniel Knipe said, we looked up on the bluffs to our right, and there were 50 warriors watching us.
Right.
And I think that's the moment that Custer changed his ideas about what he had to do. He didn't know whether there was 50 warriors or 2,000 warriors on top of that ridge. All he knew was if he went into follow Reno into combat, there could have been thousands of warriors between him and his ammunition supply train.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something very few people talk about. So in Custer's typical Custer stance, he goes right for those Indians. Doesn't follow Reno. The bad news is he doesn't communicate with Reno. And that's one of Custer's biggest problems is he doesn't communicate very effectively with Reno at that time and tell him what he's going to do. He just takes off. By the time he gets to the top of the ridge, those 50 warriors have vamoosed. They're gone. And by the way, we know warriors that were up there. We know some of their names that were looking down. So we know it's a fact.
Yeah, yeah.
You can do it both ways. You can see both ways. So Custer gets up there, and that's when he sees the village for the first time. He doesn't know where the village is running. He doesn't see Reno attack. Reno hasn't attacked yet. And this is where he says, I think we've got him this time, boys. And you got to remember that Sitting Bull got away from him twice in 1873, but we got him this time. He's talking about the same Indians. And so you've got to put all this kind of stuff together. But I think really he was planning on doing what he did at the Ouachita at this point. He's trying to hit the village from a different angle, just like he did at the Ouachita.
Mm-hmm.
It worked at the Ouachita. Why shouldn't it work along the Little Bighorn?
Okay. All right. And then another contentious area tends to be Medicine Tail Coulee, Ford B, not D this time, but Ford B. What do you think happens as his 5 companies reach Medicine Tail Coulee?
Well, there's a lot of controversy whether 5 companies got to the river. Yeah. And I don't understand that controversy. And I know that it's come from several people. My good friend, Rich Fox, was one of the first people to talk about that it was maybe possibly a decoy or a chance to look at the ford or whatever. The fact of the matter is there's too many eyewitness accounts and too much research. And by the way, map research as well.
Okay.
Custer did not divide his 5 companies.
Okay.
He galloped, as Martin said, he galloped as fast as he could get down to the river crossing down there. And that's about where he sent back with the message, as you know. John Martin gets the famous message to Benteen to bring up the pack mules and to be quick. And so anyway, all 5 companies get to the river. We know that for a fact. He said, well, how do we know that for a fact? Because John Martin, when he listens to the message, looks back, he sees all 5 companies there at the edge of the river. Okay. Not only that, but there's been other soldier accounts that have been forgotten and omitted. There were actually 2 or maybe 3 other soldiers that left after John Martin. And they left with horses. There were officer horses. There were extra horses. Custer didn't want them going into the village with these extra horses because the men couldn't fight. He had those men leave with those horses. Pickard was one of them. A guy named Charles Bates was another one.
Okay.
A lot of questions about the fellow who said he was Gustav Korn, whether he was there. That's an iffy, questionable account. I think he was in the area, but I think he was also one of the guys with horses that was taken out from that area. He never said he went across the river. If you read Gustav Korn's accounts, those accounts came from fellow soldiers later on. So, but I think, again, this is where Gustav Korn's idea comes in. He said that Keogh was leading the attack. He said he was getting down towards the river and he saw him down there. And so giving, again, Custer's seniority rating for his officers, next in command, and the man who had never fought Indians for the most part was Miles Keogh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So he lets him lead the charge. And I think One of the things that's in my book that most people have never read before is the fact that a year after they found his shoe down by the edge of the river.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about that.
And then they also find his bloody canvas legging after that he was shot. And most people know he was shot in the leg.
Mm-hmm.
So there's also other evidence that I personally think Company I, their command structure was pretty much decimated there at the ford.
Okay.
It was boggy. It was quicksand on the other side. It was difficult to cross. They supposedly found either Bustard or Porter's horse across there. As we know, Porter's body his uniform was found right there at the edge of the village as well. There's something that most people don't know is that a guy named Corporal Wild, John Wild,
Mm-hmm.
marker is shown up on the Keogh sector. He was also found down there when they were recovering bodies a year later. And they moved his body up to the Keogh sector where everybody assumes he was killed. So if you begin to match, and I don't want to get into too much information, but there's also Indian accounts. By the way, Corporal John Wild was the guide-on carrier for Company I,
Right.
the White Cow Bulls account. He shot a man in a buckskin suit down there. David Humphreys Miller, of course, said it was Custer, but it wasn't. It was Keogh.
Yeah.
Corporal John Wild was also shot down there. So here's an account that also matches the circumstantial evidence found on the other side of the river with that Company I structure. So I think they were in big trouble. And Custer had wounded men right there at the edge of the river and didn't know what to do with them.
I think all 5 companies are going down to the river. You think they're skirmishing down there. What do you think of the evidence up around Nye Cartwright and Loose Ridges? What do you think that represents?
Well, there's different Indian accounts, and they talk about 2 companies heading up towards the Calhoun Hill area. That's a pretty common story that you hear from warrior accounts. But we know that probably 3 companies went up on top of Nye Cartwright, and they fought up there for 20 or 30 minutes.
Okay.
And again, that's John Stanton Timber's account. He talks about, he was the first man to talk about that. There are other warriors that talk about it in minimal terms, and the reason being is most of the warriors are fighting Reno at the time.
Mm-hmm.
There's not many accounts of Nye Cartwright fighting because most of the warriors are fighting Reno and engaged. So it's a matter of just timing.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that you can't be in 2 places at one time. And I think they all reunited, as many of the warriors talk about. They all reunited on Calhoun Hill. And at that point, evidently, 2 companies head on down past Custer Hill and advance. That seems to be the common, if you look at the Indian test, you had to run on the Indian testimony at this point.
Yeah, right.
And their maps as well, because at this point, there's no soldiers going to survive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Be able to talk about it.
So in your view, Mike, then, do these companies at Ford B, Medicine Tail, do they get right down to the river's edge? I know some Indian accounts at least were interpreted as, no more than 1/4 of a mile or 3/4 of a mile. Do you see them getting right down to the edge of the river?
There's too many Indian accounts that talk about Company E being close to the river.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You know that they were down there. And there's also evidence that maybe James Sturgis was shot and killed down there. Again, his body was never found like Porter's. Two Moons talks about that. They took bodies down by that area and they took them into the camp that night. So there's a reason why there wasn't physical evidence found by the soldiers a couple of days later, because the warriors talk about pulling those bodies into the camp and celebrating and dancing around them the night of the victory there. But yeah, I think all 5 companies got down there. I think the fight was probably maybe 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes max. I think the fighting, again, I've done a lot of timing on this thing as well. Not only time rides across the battlefield, but trying to figure out what Reno and Benteen were hearing and when they were hearing it. Right. And there's no doubt in my mind that the gunfire they heard 10 minutes after they got on the hill was coming from Nye Cartwright Ridge.
Mm-hmm.
And you have people in the valley also hearing that same timing. And so it helps you to kind of time the fact that Medicine Tail takes place at about the same time that Reno's attack is taking place, by the way. There's probably 5 minutes between the two. And that blows a lot of people away.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, it all comes back to John Martin, because when John Martin gets back up on Weir Point in that area, by that time, Reno's falling back. He actually sees. So the timing is really easy. We kind of know how long Reno fought in the valley. Custer's fighting at the ford. It all begins to kind of make some sense. And there's been too many people that have tried to take a minute-by-minute stance about Little Bighorn. Yeah. And I can shoot a hole in every one of their theories. And that's why I never talk about timing to the minute. Never do that. Mm-hmm. You just can't prove it. I can disprove it, but you can't prove it.
Yeah, right. Right.
It's real easy to disprove. It's like a house of cards. Once you knock down one card, all the cards fall down.
Mm-hmm.
And you got certain writers that say that Custer waited 30, 45 minutes in Medicine Tail. There's no way that happened.
Okay. All right.
Didn't.
And so at this point, Custer makes the decision to continue north. Do you think at this point he's already got it in his head? I'm going to go for the non-combatants, and there may be some evidence that they are fleeing in that direction. Or I don't want to put words in your mouth. What do you think he's doing at that point?
I think, again, one of the things that people forget is in a battle, there's wounded men.
Mm-hmm.
And Terry's last orders to Custer were, Custer, whatever you do, hold on to your wounded. Because he saw what happened at the Powder River fight. And with some people were court-martialed over that. Terry didn't want to have to deal with that. I think that's specifically why he gives Custer those orders. And I think Custer's trying to follow those orders. Keogh might have been one of the wounded.
Right.
He was probably the wounded down there. What do you do with your wounded men? What are you supposed to do with them? Leave them? You're not going to leave them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they came up to Calhoun Hill, which is a perfect defensive spot, almost like Reno Hill. And I think he had to put his horses and his wounded in there.
Okay.
Knowing Custer, you can't move those wounded men and attack a camp. Or you can't even round up non-combatants with those wounded men. So I think that's why he leaves some men on Calhoun Hill to protect those wounded, because he can't have them killed. And by the way, you got to remember that Custer's, in all of his 4 Indian fights, has lost like 2 or 3 guys. It's beyond his computer hard drive that he's going to lose 200 men. It's something that Custer could not fathom. He couldn't fathom that because it didn't happen in his first 3 Indian fights. He lost 19 guys who rode off, which he kind of considered to their death because they rode off without permission for the most part, with Elliott and those guys. But for the most part, in the combat itself situation, he lost very few guys. And so I really think he thought he was in pretty good shape. He left the guys up there in their skirmish lines. He takes off on the backside of the ridge where you can't see him. He goes to the river. And a lot of the warriors don't even know he's down there. There's one warrior account that says, oh, we were shocked. All of a sudden, the soldiers were behind us.
Yeah.
And I've always thought that, boy, that's like the red light right there. Here's a warrior who's fighting these soldiers on the hill, and all of a sudden, there's soldiers behind him. And a lot of them didn't even know he's down there. So it's fascinating stuff.
Oh, yeah, it is. And so in that point where Custer's sort of parsed himself out to 2 companies, do you think there's enough resistance on that end ultimately to prevent those 2 companies from crossing? Or again, is he trying some sort of feint? Just in your view, what do you think's going on?
My view at this point, he doesn't have a lot of ammunition.
Okay.
He's concerned about his ammo. I think he's waiting for Benteen to get over here. And Benteen's not coming. And he waits and he waits. Matter of fact, John Stanton said he waited for 20 minutes. And we couldn't understand why he was waiting. That speaks volumes right there. And then you go back to Reno. Reno attacks the camp and in 15 minutes shoots up 50 of his 100 rounds.
Right.
In 15 minutes. And Custer's fighting for almost 2 hours. How much ammo do these guys have left? A fight on Calhoun Hill, a fight on Night Cartwright, a fight down there at the river. Custer must have been trying to conserve ammunition. He must have been trying to do that. And when you do that, it emboldens your enemy.
Right.
No doubt about it.
Right.
And so anyway, I think that's just a pure theory.
Sure.
Pure theory. Maybe there were 3,000 women and children. He was not about to go across the river. Totally outnumbered. It's different than getting 53 women and children when there's 3,000 of them there. And warriors mixed in with them, by the way.
Yeah.
It's not just women and children. So that's one of those things we'll never know. But I suspect by the time he gets down there after an hour of fighting, he's being really concerned about his ammunition, waiting for Benteen to get over there. And Benteen's not going to arrive, not in time.
And then as we kind of start to work our way towards the conclusion here, what do you think ultimately causes that rally on what we know today is Last Stand Hill?
Yeah. It's interesting. The warriors themselves said our greatest ally was anger.
Yeah.
And while Custer was able to get into the Ouachita camp and capture 53 women and children in a few minutes, he couldn't do that there. And those warriors were fighting for their families, fighting for their way of life, but especially for their families down there. And they were going to fight with a passion and fight with the determination that Custer had never seen in his career. at long. And one of the things that, again, people kind of ignore, Reno's greatest fear in the valley was losing his what? Horses. That's why Reno disappears from the skirmish line after 5 minutes, because he hears that the Warriors are penetrating and about to capture his horses. And if you lose your horses, you lose half your ammunition. And that's one of Reno's greatest fears. Well, I think that was a fear of the soldiers with Custer as well. When they began to lose their horses along the Battle Ridge, along Calhoun Hill, and we know from these Indian maps, by the way, that I published in the book, that there was some horses stampeded down near the river where Custer was.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about that in several different accounts. So here's Custer, who may be losing horses down there. Now you have men on foot. What are you going to do? You're running out of ammunition. You don't have much ammunition. You've got dismounted men. The only thing he can do is make a defensive stand and pray that somebody comes to help him.
Yeah.
Because somebody came to help him at the Ouachita. Somebody came to help him on August the 4th, 1873. Somebody came to help him, Stanley, by the way. Stanley came to help him on August the 11th, where you and I talked. He always had a backup. At the last minute, somebody saved his cookies. Guess what didn't happen at Little Bighorn?
Right. They didn't come through.
Nobody saved his cookies.
Yeah.
And I think Custer, in his own reckless manner, expected that to happen once again.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me.
You know, it related to the last stand, you talked about at the beginning of this, you talked about the obvious value of the archaeology. And yet, nevertheless, we to this day still see people criticizing at least some of the findings and the conclusions that came out of the archaeology. Probably one of the most contentious aspects, I think, of Richard Fox's findings was the notion of the last stand.
Right.
And I kind of feel like when I read Fox or when I see old interviews on YouTube or DVDs or whatever, Fox talks about it being desperate fighting, but you get the sense he's trying to couch the idea that he doesn't think there was this mythic last stand of legend. And of course, again, that angers a lot of people and, maybe in some cases for good reason, but what's your take?
Well, I used to believe a lot of Fox's writings, but as the years went by, and by the way, his research is 30 or 40 years old now.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of new stuff that's come out. We found different stuff on the battlefield in different parts. One of the things that Rich is all about is the archaeology. He's an archaeologist. So his theories were based, and by the way, he was the first guy to really, really use Indian accounts to try to decipher what happened. And I applaud him for doing that because he did an amazing job. But being an archaeologist, he only relied on the things that he and his volunteers found. They didn't use any of the archaeological information found outside the fence. They didn't look at the history of what had happened on certain locations on the battlefield. Some of that he was probably unaware of, and that's not his fault because he wasn't around for 35 years like me.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I've been able to talk to a lot of people who are
we
local.
can all be so lucky. Yeah.
Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, there was a lot of casings found outside by Hank Wybert near Calhoun Hill. Lots and lots of Indian casings on an Indian position out there. However, no bullets found hardly at all in the Keogh sector, which Fox attributes to the fact that there was very little fighting there.
Mm-hmm.
Pure chaos.
Kind of the stampede.
They were run over, a stampede.
Yeah.
Okay. But what happened to all those bullets from all those casings found by Wybert? Where are they? They can only be shot in that specific area right there. Here's your answer. Wybert used to jump over the fence at night with a gunny sack and a flashlight and metal detect the hell out of that area. There's the missing bullets. Talk about those things because they were found illegally. Not only did he do it there, other people that I have talked to metal detected the hell at night on Last Stand Hill, being a bulldog casing up there.
Yeah.
In his collection. And let's face it, every dog and every soldier and every civilian who went on Last Stand Hill was looking for souvenirs.
Right, exactly.
So you take that, you take the illegal metal detecting that took place out there, and that tempers your research. It distorts your story, it distorts your research.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And until you include those things and what's missing today, And they took samples and all that, but so much of that's been pilfered. As horrible as it is, that's what's happened to much of the material in certain locations. So that's why I have to dismiss some of that. There was not much fighting there because the archaeological evidence was there at one time, but it's not there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most people can understand that.
Yeah, and I got to give a shout out to the Weibert's archaeology book, Custer's Cases and Cartridges. I always thought that was a fantastic book.
Yeah, the big one.
Yeah, and
I use it all the time.
Somehow, I think if you married that and Fox, you would possibly get as close to the answer as we can get today. Okay, we're almost out of time. I just got a few more questions. Since we've come this far, I got to ask you the $1 million question. What's your take on Deep Ravine? Are we ever going to find bodies there? Were they not there? Are we looking in the wrong place? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I do believe there's bodies probably still there.
Okay.
There's and some people know about this. There's a little section in the back of one of the appendix of my book where the rivers are in red, and we talk about the Deep Ravine situation. I think one of the things that people have not understood about the battle at the Ouachita, when Custer was getting pushed by the warriors, he sent companies out to push them back, and it worked. It worked at the Ouachita. He also does that at the Little Bighorn. At the other end of Calhoun Hill, he sends Company C off to push the warriors back, and it works for a few minutes until that all crumbles.
Okay.
He does the same thing on Custer Hill, and Two Moon talks about a trumpet call, and all of a sudden, about 50 men or 40 men on foot went off, and they took a little ridge down below, and they were again doing what they were doing at the end of the ridge, driving warriors that were shooting. We know from archaeology today that there was a lot of warriors lined up against what we call Cemetery Ravine. I wish we had a map here, but we don't. But anyway, they're catching gunfire. Last Stand Hill is catching a lot of gunfire from that direction. Also, there's horses. The gray horses are down in that area below there. So Company E is sent down to fight in that area down there. It's not a run to the river. Everybody wants to be, they were scared.
Okay.
They're running for their lives. Let me ask, anybody who's got some common sense knows that we're not going to leave one company on the hill to die and the other ones to escape. We're going to blow a trumpet. You guys go away. We're going to stay here and die. Okay. That was an offensive move that turned into a disaster. And here's the key ingredient. The key ingredient is a story by Big Beaver, who was a Cheyenne, who's killing the men on Last Stand Hill. He's up there killing the wounded. And this is a great, and it's in two different accounts by him. And it's been ignored by historians for a long time. I looked down where the cemetery is today, and there were still men fighting down there, about 20 of them. They were the men who rode gray horses. And they began to run out of ammunition, and they began to run to a deep ravine where they tried to escape. And here's a young boy who sees it. And the timing is also one. The last, and almost every, not every Indian, but almost every Indian war says the last fighting took place in the deep ravine. And they chased men down there. And of course, we know there's been books written about this and articles written about it. They weren't ever there and all that. There's too many maps. Again, here goes to the map thing. If you look at all the maps in drawing battle lines, you see that it's very clearly stated by Indians and soldiers there were bodies found down in that ravine. And what's happened over the years is very quickly after the battle, even as the soldiers kicked off dirt on the bodies, that ravine began to slump. And the ravine today looks nothing like it did in 1876. And tons of dirt have fallen on top of whatever was there. And so when they metal detected down there, they found nothing, except for soldier cartridges right there where Daniel Knipe, who saw the bodies, showed Walter Camp where they were found.
Okay.
So in 1994, they took ground penetrating research technology, went all down through that area, and found absolutely nothing except where Camp said the bodies were. And they were deeply buried there. Now, they don't say it's bodies. They say it was a strange anomaly, but that's the only place we found an anomaly. And there was actually talk when Gerard Baker was there of actually doing a dig and trying to find those guys if they're still there. And they came really close in the 94, 95 digs. I mean, 84, 85 digs, excuse me. They came close. They dug a trench real close to that area, but they didn't go deep enough. And I can't get into too many details because I've seen the study and they don't share that with a lot of people. But until a relative comes up and says, hey, one of my relatives died on a battlefield. He's missing action. Congress, I want you to find him. That's what it's going to take to find those guys.
Okay.
The Park Service is in no hurry to dig them up. Some people say leave them alone. Others say we need to find them, research them like any other body was found on the battlefield, find out more information.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a real interesting dilemma, and perhaps someday, and also we have to talk about damage to the resource.
Yeah.
It's going to cost a lot of money. Maybe National Geographic would want to do something like that. Who knows? But I believe they were never dug up. I still think they're deeply buried there from the ground penetrating research.
Wow. So at Gettysburg, we have a saying. When General Pickett was asked why Lee's army lost, it's always been alleged that Pickett said, I think the Yankees had something to do with it. And of course, in Little Bighorn, we're always focused on why did Custer lose? Why did Custer lose? Not why did the Native Americans win? From your perspective, now Gettysburg, sometimes we have to tell this massive 3-day battle in 2 hours.
Yeah.
So you as an interpretive ranger can appreciate more than anybody that sometimes you got to be concise and get to the point while your visitors got to move on to somewhere else. So kind of in a concise closing here, why do you think the outcome turned out the way it did? Whether you want to say why did the Indians win or why did Custer lose so resoundingly? What do you think happened?
I think it's kind of funny your remark you just made. I think there's probably people that come to Little Bighorn and say, how can you Rangers take a 2-hour battle and turn it into a 3-day talk? We kind of flip that sometimes, but I think one of the things, and I have said this many times to the visitors there, and I've talked to over 1 million people there over my 35 years, and one of the things, and everybody always comes up and says, well, why did Custer lose? Why did Custer lose? And I quite often say it's because the Indians won.
Right.
They were highly motivated. They used the terrain in an amazing way. They used strategies like getting rid of the horses and capturing the ammunition in the saddlebags. These guys were some of the best light cavalry of the plains. They knew how to fight. They knew how they had a dress rehearsal a week before at the Battle of Rosebud. And if you look at what they try to do there, they stretched those troops along Colmar Ridge and pulled them till they were like a rubber band about to break. Except at Rosebud, Crook was able to pull them back. Well, the rubber band broke because Custer stretched it too far. And he got outside of his reinforcements and his people that he could communicate with. He also had some people that were reticent to come his direction for whatever reason.
Right.
And, one of the things that I always tell people about Little Bighorn, I don't have a dog in this fight. And so many people come to the battlefield with I'm a Custer defender, I'm a Reno defender, I'm a Benteen. I don't really play those games.
Yeah.
I just kind of let things talk about how the things happened. And you have to be honest and you have to be thoughtful and you have to do some deep research. But again, the Warriors had the motivation that Custer had never seen before. I think that was one of the major differences.
Okay. Dog in the fight. There's some stories I could tell you about here at Gettysburg.
Oh, you bet. Well. I bet you got you got lots of dogs to fight over there.
Yeah, we do. Well, look, I promised you we would not go on for too long. I could easily sit here and just ask you questions all night. I mentioned this when I recorded my introduction. We haven't talked about it. I don't know if you realize it looking at the calendar or not. When we said, hey, let's do Tuesday night, December 5th, as we're recording here, George Armstrong Custer's birthday. So,
there we go.
For me at least,
must be there's something there's some energy out there somewhere.
Yeah. I'd like to say I'm going to tell people we planned it that way, but really, it just totally worked out like this.
It just happened. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so drawing battle lines, where the rivers ran red, and folks, you heard it here first tonight. Mike is working on book number 3, but for the books that are out right now, where can people find them?
Yeah, they can contact me directly. And that's at michaeldonahueart.com. They can contact me. Not only do I have my books on there, but I have my artwork that I sell online. Although most of that's sold, I do sell some prints. I have some Custer prints. I did a painting of Custer's Last Stand after watching 1,000 artists do it. Thought I had to do my version as well. And it took a year to do. It's got a lot of research in it and so forth. It's my version. Probably the only version where Custer's not fighting. He's actually looking through his binoculars saying, "Where the hell's Benteen?"
Where's Benteen? Is that the title of the work? Where the hell
That's
is
the title of the
Benteen?
painting. That's the title of the painting.
That's what
He's
I
not
thought.
slashing away with his saber. And it's probably one of the few vertical compositions. Almost every artist does a horizontal competition or a composition of Little Bighorn and Custer's Last Stand. I did it for the cover of my book. What's great about being an artist, you can do your own book covers.
Yeah. Yeah. A guy like me who can't draw 2 stick figures has to always pay somebody to do all that stuff for my books.
You do a great job. But anyway, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you allowing me to talk to your group, and I hope they got something beneficial out of it. And again, it's a real honor and a privilege, not only to hang out with you verbally over the internet, but hopefully we'll see each other in person again soon.
Mike, the pleasure has been all mine. I can't thank you enough for taking some time out of your evening. You're in your final exams at work. You've got a lot of stuff going on, and I really owe you a favor after doing this one. And hopefully we will see each other either on your battlefield or my battlefield sometime during the summer of 2024. So, Mike Donahue, thank you very much for joining the Battle of Gettysburg podcast. Take care.
Thank you, Jim.